So first question, how difficult is it become for third-party candidates like you to get on the ballot in New York State?
Well, it's more difficult than any other state in the nation now, because they basically tripled the number of votes we need to keep a ballot line and tripled the number of signatures we need to get a ballot line. So there were 8 attempts in 2022 by different candidates. None of us succeeded. So it's really the ballot access law is exclusionary.
And has that ballot access become a major issue for you?
Yeah, it's the biggest reason we're saying people should write us in to protest this exclusionary ballot access law, to vote for democracy.
What are some of the key issues to your campaign?
Well, the democracy issue, we want an inclusive democracy, a multi-party democracy. We want a Green New Deal to get to 100% clean energy and zero greenhouse gas emissions in a decade. And we want an economic bill of rights. So the right to a living wage job, an income above poverty, affordable housing, comprehensive health care, and lifelong public education from child care through college is available to everybody.
Getting third-party candidates on the ballot, what reforms would you like to see implemented?
We could go back to the standard we had before the 2020 law, which was about a third as challenging. It's difficult, but we did have then independent candidates from smaller parties on the ballot, in the debates, in the discussion, and that's good for democracy.
Friends, please welcome the leader of the New York State and National Green Party, Howie Hawkins.
Well, thank you, and thanks everybody for coming out. I'm just going to talk briefly about what's at stake in this gubernatorial election, and then let's do mostly question and answers. I think the first thing at stake in this election is democracy. Andrew Cuomo and the Democrats, the Republicans mostly didn't vote for it, but they're worried about the Libertarians, so if they get stronger, they will do the same thing as they are in some states. Changed ballot access law in 2020 when the legislature was meeting virtually. They attached it to the budget bill. It's not a budget item. And what they did was more than triple the number of votes we needed to keep a ballot line. It used to be 50,000 for governor. It was changed to 130,000 or 2%, whichever is greater. 2% is always greater. And in 2020, it was 173,000 and change. So it was more than 3.5 times, or about 3.5 times, what we had to get before. And in 2018, I got over double the 50,000 votes. In 2020, they changed the law on us, and then we had to get that higher standard in the presidential election with Trump on the ballot. Very difficult for the Greens because a lot of progressive-minded people said, I got to vote for the Democrats to stop Trump. And so difficult year, we didn't get enough votes. And then they changed the petition requirement from 15,000 in 42 days, which is difficult, to 45,000 in 42 days. And this year there were 8 attempts by different gubernatorial tickets to reach that standard. None of them did. The only one that claimed to have done it is the Republican candidate Lee Zeldin. And he got caught photocopying over 11,000 of his signatures and then sprinkling them through his petition. And 45,000 stacks up. He tried to commit fraud. And this is a guy that said Biden was elected by fraud. He didn't vote to certify. He's a member of Congress. Didn't vote to certify that election. This guy's a fraudster. He's an insufferable hypocrite. And then on the Democratic side, Hochul hasn't said anything about the fact that only she and Zeldin were on the stage when they debated a week ago. I debated Cuomo twice. In fact, he didn't want to debate in 2018 because I called him out in 2014 for his hypocrisy. There was a so-called Moreland Commission on Public Corruption because we got a politician crime wave in this state. We have about 50 high elected officials been caught stealing money, taking bribes, doing sexual things, harassment and whatnot. And, we've lost what? Two comptrollers, an attorney general. Was Spitzer governor when he had to go, or was he? Yeah, we lost the governor, the 2 Republican leaders of the Senate, Democratic Speaker of the Assembly, and a bunch of assemblymen and senators. You know, for all kinds of criminal, corrupt things. So here we got Zeldin, who's shown himself to be a fraudster, and Kathy Hochul, who doesn't know how to do politics except pay to play. The Buffalo Billion, the second Buffalo Billion, the stadium for the Buffalo Bills billionaire. First of all, the money comes from the Seneca Nation, which had it in escrow. They're negotiating their relationship to the state and their gambling interests and so forth. She grabbed that and handed it over to this billionaire because he threatened to move the stadium. And it just so happens that her husband has concessions at the stadium and interest in gambling around Buffalo, which, you know, when the Bills have a lot of people coming to town, a lot of people gamble. So, you know, that was corrupt right to begin with. And then she is approving $1.2 billion in tax breaks for a developer around Penn Station that's going to destroy that neighborhood. Thousands of jobs, small businesses, and residences in order to put up 10 high-rise office buildings in a city that has excess office buildings right now. They can't fill it. But what that guy did was give her, I forget the numbers. I got it in press releases. Go to that website, you can get the numbers. But the general picture is these guys give 6-figure donations to the governor, and she gives them hundreds of millions or even billions in tax breaks and contracts. There's a guy down in the New York area. He got, for a few $100,000 contribution, he got a $637 million contract to provide home COVID kits at a cost 1.5 times what California got those kits for because they did competitive bidding. But he was a big contributor. He got the contract. In my area, Syracuse, there's a agency that provides transportation to Medicaid agents, giving lots of money to Hochul over the years. So for a few $100,000, they got a contract worth over $5 billion over 5 years. So it's technically legal, but it's legalized bribery. That's how the political system works. So coming back to the elections, I'm arguing you should write in Howie Hawkins and Gloria Matera as a statement of protest to the fact that they made it impossible for the smaller independent parties to be on the ballot and be part of the debate and the process in the election. But it's worse than that. Even without that, we have a system of single-member district winner-take-all to elect to the legislatures. And what that means is you got, first of all, the spoiler problem, because people might like the Greens, but they're worried about the Republicans, so they vote for the Democrat. They settle for that, the lesser evil. So you really don't get a reflection of what people want. If they want the New York Health Act, which is a single-payer public insurance system for health care that would cover everybody, and they vote for Hochul to stop Zeldin, they're voting against that program. There's no way, without worrying about spoiling an election, to vote for us who do support that program without maybe helping Zeldin. So you got the spoiler problem. And then you got the gerrymandering problem, which is even worse, because the politicians carve up the districts, dole them out so they're safe districts, mostly for incumbents. So most districts are not competitive. They're farcical elections. We know who's going to win before the election happens. They're like one-party states. So why the hell vote? If you're a Democrat in a majority Republican district, or a Republican in a majority Democratic district, or a Green and Libertarian in any district, you can vote and vote and vote and never get anybody that represents your political point of view. That's the system we got. So in addition to fair ballot access, we need to talk about ranked choice voting for all the statewide offices, including the senators and the president, and then proportional representation through ranked choice voting in multi-member districts, so that every political viewpoint gets its fair and proportional share of representation in the legislature. And we're in a period now where 60% of Americans are going to go to the poll, or are going to the polls now, and there's an election denier running for Senate, Congress, Comptroller, or I'm sorry, Secretary of State, Attorney General, or the House of Representatives, or Governor. 60% of us, have that candidate on our ballot in this country. 1 in 6 election workers has been threatened. You saw these guys in their camouflage and tactical gear and bulletproof vests and masks and shades, filming people dropping their ballots off at the drop boxes in the Phoenix area. That kind of thing is going on all over the country. That's probably the most extreme example. So you've got on the Republican side an attack on people's right to vote. There have been 42 laws passed in 20 states that restrict voting. But what have the Democrats done? They could have, and there were laws, introduced and passed in the House to restore voting rights, bring some of the provisions back into the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court has knocked out, and then to protect elections so that you don't have voter intimidation, or in some of the states, the Republicans have got it so the state legislature can overrule the popular vote, particularly when it comes to electing presidential electors. And then they've taken the power from election officials and put it in the legislature to basically rule on election questions. So they're basically setting it up to rig and steal elections. Legislation in Congress passed the House, goes to the Senate. And of course, there the Republicans veto with the filibuster. And the Democrats did not make that a high priority and a major public controversy. They basically shrugged. And they're focused on Build Back Better and so forth. And, it didn't become an issue. So, who's protecting our voting rights, our democratic rights? I think we need an independent left to do that, because the Democrats have shown it's really not a high priority for them, and the Republicans are doing a full frontal assault on suppressing the vote. The Democrats are more subtle. They suppress the vote by suppressing parties, particularly the Green Party. And that, we know from exit polls in 2016 that 61% of Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate for president's voters, told the exit pollsters they would have stayed home if she was not on the ballot. 55% of the Libertarian Party candidate, Gary Johnson's voters, would have stayed home. Those are millions of voters who, if the Democrats have their way, they're not going to have those options, because the Democrats, have been pushing, not just in New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, Arkansas, and when I was running for president, we had it in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Montana, Texas. And I won't go into the details, but I will tell you the judges are hacks. Republicans always voted for us and Democrats always against us. Facts in the law didn't matter. It was partisan. So, we got a real democracy crisis. And so this vote, I think the most important reason to write in me and Gloria Matera is to protest what they did about restricting access of parties to the ballot and say you want democracy. So, and just to instruct you on how to do a write-in vote if you haven't voted yet, there's a column for governor. There are 4 lines where you got the 2 Democrat and Republican. They both have 2 lines. You got supposed third parties, working families, always endorses the Democrat, conservatives always endorse the Republicans. So it's kind of a farcical multi-party system. 4 ballot lines, 2 candidates in almost every election. But you keep going down to the bottom and there's a write-in column. And then you write in Howie Hawkins, Gloria Matera. You see how Matera is spelled up there? Keep the writing within the box so they won't count it. And it's a small box, so, be careful. So democracy, that's a big issue. We're calling for an inclusive democracy. If you picked up our, palm card, it was on the tables out there, I got some here. That's one of the 3 things we're running on. The other things are the progressive agenda. And we're advocating things many progressive Democrats have advocated. And got into legislation in the Assembly and the Senate, but it haven't passed. And, you know, top of that list is the New York Health Act. That first passed, an early version of it, in the New York State Assembly in 1992. Passed repeatedly. And the Democrats said, give us the Senate and we'll get it done. Well, they won the Senate in 2018. They won a supermajority in the Senate in 2020. And since 2018, that bill has not got out of committee in the Senate or the Assembly. In the meantime, the health insurance industry really poured money into the Democratic Party. So Heastie and, you know, and the Speaker of the Assembly and Stuart Cousins, the leader in the Senate, have not wanted it moved forward. You know, they're more responsive, the Democrats, to their donors than to their voters. And this is a popular issue. So we're the only ticket advocating for the New York Health Act. And the Green New Deal was mentioned. That, Gloria Matera was my running mate in 2010. And we were the first candidates in this country to campaign for a Green New Deal, which was a plan to get to 100% clean energy and zero greenhouse gas emissions in a decade. And back then we were talking about 2020. And we were basing it on the, you know, climate science we're getting from people like James Hansen, Kevin Anderson in the UK, and so forth. And here we are 12 years later, and we're in much worse shape. We're in a real crisis. So we're still advocating that. And we had a bill coming into 2018 called the New York Off Act, Off Fossil Fuels. And it really was a 10-year plan to get to 100% clean energy. Instead, the progressives had a milder bill, and they compromised that with Andrew Cuomo. And so you have the Community or Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which since it's been enacted has not been funded, and the study groups that are supposed to be developing the plans are way behind schedule. So they're not taking it seriously. There are bills to fund it that did not pass. There are bills to implement part of it, particularly in the power industry, so that New York Power Authority could build and own renewable generation facilities. Another bill to make the whole public, or the whole utility system, a public system, so we could plan and coordinate this complicated and rapid transition we need. And, you know, that bill got nowhere because they didn't want to take on the utility interests, which are powerful and contribute a lot of money to the political system. So, you know, if you want a Green New Deal, you know, vote for the Green Party, vote for this ticket. And let me just say a few words, and afterwards, there's a journal called Against the Current. I had an article in here, Which Green New Deal? It's a few years old now, but it basically said, you know, the Greens came out with a Green New Deal. It was our signature issue in the 2010s. And then the Sunrise Movement and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat in Pelosi's office and said, we want a Green New Deal. And what happened? Well, what they wanted was a select committee that could put legislation right on the floor and have it voted on. Pelosi said, no, 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 we're going to put it through my committees, including, I forget the name of it, Energy and Commerce, I think it's called, with this New Jersey Congress member who's a very fossil-fueled politician, lots of fossil fuel money. And, you know, so what AOC and with Edward Markey did was come back. Could you give me some apple cider? Getting dry throat. But, and they watered down Green New Deal the Greens have been talking about. They eliminated the ban on new fossil fuel infrastructure and fracking. They eliminated the phase out of nuclear power. AOC's pro-nuke now. They eliminated deep cuts in military spending to help fund the Green New Deal. And then they extended the deadline from 10 years out to 30 years out. At that time, 2050. And they changed the goal from real zero emissions to net zero emissions, which is a backdoor for the fossil fuel industry to keep burning fossil fuels and supposedly capture the carbon and put it into the ground. And what they've been doing, there are about a dozen of these facilities around, is they pump it into oil wells to create pressure to get more oil out of these fracked oil wells. So it's really not helping us too much in decarbonizing the economy. So the Green New Deal. And then the other thing is we call it the Economic Bill of Rights. And this is something that's been on the table since Franklin Roosevelt raised it in his last 2 State of the Union addresses. And the way we talk about it is the way the civil rights movement, A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, and those guys changed it, starting with the March on Washington in 1963 through the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. So it includes a job guarantee, the right to a living wage job, an income above poverty. And that was King's big thing, a guaranteed minimum income. And in his last book, he said, you know, I've come to the conclusion the most direct way to end poverty is to give people money. What do poor people lack? They lack money, so give it to them. There are other things, you know, some people are poor because they got problems, addictions, you know, they're disabled, they're old and single, whatever it is, you can deal with those problems too. But the first thing is just make sure people have enough money. Build it into the tax structure as a negative income tax. So right to a job, an income above poverty, affordable housing. And there we're advocating stuff that's already in the legislature, good cause eviction law, so landlords just can't, for no reason, evict you. Usually the reason is they want you out, they want to jack up the rents, fix the place up, and gentrify. So we need that. There's rent control. The state allows that. It needs to be used more in upstate. But those are interim solutions. The longer-term solution is to build enough affordable housing. And the most cost-effective way to do that is public housing. Now, there's a cap on what the federal government can do, thanks to Andrew Cuomo when he was head of HUD and Bill Clinton. It's called the Faircloth Amendment. So in this country, public housing units are less than 1% of all units. Go to Western Europe, it's 20% and up. City of Vienna, it's 60%. And when you have that high a level of public housing, and over there, you don't have to be poor to go in. You can go in at any level. You just pay rent scaled to your income and the size of the apartment you're getting and so forth. So they're mixed income. That's not the kind of desegregation we got from the way we did public housing here, which, you know, from the 50s on was basically segregating poor people of color in the worst part of town in crappy high-rises. So we need to do it differently, but we need to build more affordable units to the point where the private market has to compete with those units and the rents will come down. So that's affordable housing. Healthcare, I already talked about that. We need a single public payer of the insurance, but we're also talking about, and this is not in legislation yet, we need to start thinking about moving beyond socialized insurance to socialized delivery, the whole system. Because corporations are taking over, not so much in this state because the hospitals have to be nonprofit, although they act like corporations, but pharmacies, dialysis clinics, ambulances, hospices, all the services that hospitals outsource are being very centralized and for-profit corporations with venture capital and private equity playing a big role, and that's getting in between the doctor and the patient as much as private insurance does. So we're saying we got to move beyond socialized insurance to socialized medicine. There was a good article March 31st in The Nation by longtime advocates of Medicare for All, and now they're saying the title was Medicare for All is not enough. You know, I suggest you look at that to fill out that argument of why we need a national health service or a state health service rather than just, you know, Medicare insurance for all. It's the kind of system Britain has, Costa Rica has, a number of countries do. So the doctors and nurses and whatnot are public employees. And the bill we've had in this country, going back to the 70s, Ron Dellums introduced it, with the help of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which came out of the Civil Rights Movement, was a community-controlled national health service. So you have locally elected health boards that federate at the state and national level to coordinate the whole system. But the local health system is then responsive to all the communities. Because one problem we have now is kind of a medical apartheid where, you know, around the universities and the more affluent communities, you've got good medical services, and in the poor communities and the rural communities, you don't. So that's the advantage of democratizing as well as socializing the system. So jobs, income, housing, healthcare, and then education. And we're calling for lifelong free public education from childcare, universal childcare, as a public system to tuition-free public college and trade schools. And the childcare thing, it's again cheaper to just directly provide it, mostly through the school system, but also in other places like public housing, than it is to contract it out. And then have scaled how much people pay. It gets like the mixed public and private insurance system we have for healthcare. In that system, 30% of the healthcare dollar goes to bureaucracy. You know, the doctors provide a treatment, and the hospital then, you know, asks for reimbursement, and a lot of times the insurance companies say, well, no, you shouldn't authorize that treatment. Or they have to ask for the treatment first and they don't get authorization. And all this back and forth goes on, all this paperwork. Plus, you all look pretty young, but if you've tried to look through insurance plans from your employer or just for your family, I mean, you get a big thick book with 100 different plans and you can't figure out any of them. You know, and then you got to go back to the person that gave you the book. Well, here's my situation. What do you recommend? It's insane. So it's a lot simpler to just provide it through the public sector. So that's the Economic Bill of Rights. And, you know, this encompasses and expands upon what the broad progressive movement in this state wants. So 3 reasons to vote for us: democracy, climate, a Green New Deal, and economic and social justice, the Economic Bill of Rights. And I think I'll stop there. I probably went longer than I thought. Don't see a clock. Okay. 4:07, what time we start? 3:30, so I went 37 minutes? Okay, that was longer than I planned, but I'll be here as long as you want to ask questions.
Questions, thoughts?
Yeah, comments too.
Do you think it's possible for any other party besides the Democratic Party to beat out the Republicans for this election?
Yeah, if we had ranked choice voting, and especially if we had proportional ranked choice voting, which means ranking your choices in multi-member districts to get proportional representation. Absolutely. You look at the polling on a lot of the things we're talking about: Green New Deal, Medicare for all, tuition-free college, student debt relief. There are a whole lot of them. We have not just majority positions, we have supermajority positions in the 60, even 70%. So they're popular programs. But people don't think the Greens can win, and they're worried about the Republicans, so they vote for the Democrats. So I think the electoral system is really a big obstacle for us. But at the local level, I mean, the Greens have a high percentage of winning. Now, in a lot of states, those are nonpartisan, so you don't see the label on the ballot. But they're really partisan because everybody knows who the Democrats and Republicans and Greens are in those elections in most cases. And, you know, I forget the percentage, but it's, you know, 25, 30, 40% wins at the local level. There are 500,000 local offices in this country. And, you know, I've been preaching this, the Greens talk about it. We should be electing, we have about 135, 140 local elected officials around the country now. We should have thousands. And on that foundation, then we get into state legislatures and the House. Those are local district elections. And if you've proved yourself in municipal or county or town offices, people see that you're responsible, you're serious, you care about people, then you can run for those offices credibly, I think. And once you start winning some of them, then people say, hey, the Greens can win. So I think that's the path. That's what the Republicans did in the 1850s. Everybody thinks Lincoln was a third-party candidate. He was a first-party candidate in 1860. Because by that time, the Republicans had the largest caucus in Congress. And they built it up over the previous decade, building upon what the Free Soil Party had done. So I think that's one path, but it'll go easier if we can get these electoral reforms. Which, let me add, we are winning. I mean, we had like 24 districts using ranked choice voting going into the 2020 election. They're now, I think it's 55 local jurisdictions in 2 states. So we've been winning. There are 10 more jurisdictions on the ballot this November. That's a fight we can win, and that opens up the political process for the Greens or any other, you know, third party. So yeah, I think it can be done. I guess the other thing I'll say is the left in this country since the 1930s has thought they could make change through the Democratic Party. You know, first it was the labor movement and the communist left, they went into the Democratic Party, and then the socialist left went in the 50s and 60s with the idea of realignment, they called it. You know, Michael Harrington, who's the godfather of DSA, that was his strategy. A. Philip Randolph bought into it after being a lifelong socialist. And so the left went into the Democratic Party and disappeared as a left, as a distinct alternative to the Democrats, who were progressive New Deal Democrats until the post-Watergate generation. And you got a generation came in and they were neoliberals. They called themselves that before neoliberalism as a description of deregulated capitalism was popular. They were the new liberals. They weren't the New Deal liberals, they were the new liberals. But by the time of Clinton, they called themselves the New Democrats, the corporate Democrats. So I think that's the problem too. The left has not, you know, the first principle of socialist politics going back to the post-1848 analysis of Marx and Engels of the 1848 elections, the springtime of peoples in Europe was, geez, you know, we allied with the middle class, you know, they call them petty bourgeois people, you know, small business professionals. And they sold us out. They got their political rights, the workers didn't. The workers had to spend the rest of the century just fighting for the vote in Europe. And so, you know, their conclusion was, you know, working people need their own political party, their own voice, independent. And the socialist left in this country has really lost that principle since the 30s. You know, most of them are working in the Democratic Party. I think it's a problem because then they end up doing the grunt work for neoliberals, corporate liberals, as we called them in the 70s, and now just basically corporate neoliberals who, you know, do believe in deregulation to the point where, and this is another critique, it's not in this article, but it's in the latest stuff I've written, the way that Democrats are now doing climate policy and even with the way they want to do the Green New Deal that AOC and Markey are talking about is, rather than doing a lot of it through the public sector where we can plan and coordinate, they want to just issue incentives to, you know, private businesses, to the corporations. It leaves all the power in the hands of the corporations. You got hundreds of corporations deciding how much they're going to do these things based on their own bottom line. It's uncoordinated. There's no, you know, timeline deadlines. When we got a deadline of climate change that's, you know, every 1/10 of a degree we go up, you know, is more damaging. So it's basically kind of a Keynesianism of, you know, public spending, but without public control. And I think that's a big problem because we can provide all kinds of incentives, but it's not going to add up. Like the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, which I call Build Back Badly because it's so watered down from Build Back Better, which for us was, you know, a low bar to begin with. And, you know, it provides incentives for upscale people, you know, to buy electric vehicles, provide some subsidies and incentives for solar and wind generation, but it doesn't provide for long distance, high voltage transmission, because a lot of the wind and solar potential is in rural areas, particularly in the Southwest and the Midwest, and the need is in the Midwest urban areas in the East and also the West Coast. So you got incentives for one thing, but you got a gap because it's not a coordinated plan. So, you know, corporate welfare is not the best way to get to climate stability and decarbonization. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Questions?
So, long answer to a short question.
Just want to get your take on this. During the 1970s, we had some of the most important conservation legislation passed with bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats, particularly during the Nixon era as president. What happened?
I think Congress got bought off, and those neoliberal Democrats, they really went after the corporate money in the 70s. And I've heard this, from Ralph Nader, who was in the middle of a lot of that legislation. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Occupational Safety and Health Act. And he'll tell you, back in the 60s and, first few years of the 70s, he could call attention to a public issue, get a member of Congress interested, they'd have a public hearing, it would follow up, would lead to legislation. Now, Ralph can't get his phone calls returned or his letters answered. And they basically cut off, the citizens movement. And the members of Congress, they now have calling hours where they spend 3 hours a day when they're in Washington dialing for dollars. I mean, that's become more of the job. It's just, so Congress has changed. I think that's a big reason. And the other thing that happened in the early 70s was, you've heard of the Powell memo? Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice, but he was a conservative lawyer who wrote this memo to the Chamber of Commerce, and he said, we're losing control of the country. Now you got to answer to black folks and women and environmentalists, and damn Ralph Nader's out there. And he thought Ralph Nader was, biggest enemy of the state. He said, the corporations got to get organized. So the chamber did. There was a thing called a business roundtable. They became very organized, and lobbying skyrocketed, and their campaign contributions skyrocketed. So I think we had, corporations were always a big influence on our politics, going back to the 1890s. And that's why in the Teddy Roosevelt administration, in 1908, they passed that law that you can't put money out of corporate treasury into political campaigns. The Supreme Court threw that out recently. But so that was a concern. But in the 70s, that accelerated. So the corporate interests have just got the upper hand right now, and they got the courts, they got the legislature, and they got the presidency. So that's the way I see that. Yes, right here.
I totally agree with what you said about building up the green power through local elections, but I do find myself struggling with a lot of my friends and older progressives who are like, no, let's focus on the Democratic Party and continue, like you were saying, to try and push the Democrats left. The Justice Democrats attempted to do this. What do you think is the best way to convince a community to start voting green?
I think you need a Green Party local that works well together, is active on issues in the community between elections, and then gives voice to those issues in elections. And also does what they call deep canvassing or relational organizing, where you knock on doors and you talk to people. You don't preach at them, here we got the green program, it's got all the answers. You ask them, what are your issues? What are your concerns? What do you think we should do? And you listen, you don't preach. And, in the course of that conversation, you can say, in response to them, well, here's what the Greens think about that problem you're concerned about. But it's not a hard sell. It's building relationships so that people see the Greens as people that are concerned. Even if they don't agree with us on policy, a lot of people say, well, the Greens come around. When do you hear from the rest of the politicians? You see them on TV and those flyers in your mailbox, and they don't do much of that door-to-door stuff. They usually have other people doing it for them whose enthusiasm is not always the greatest. A lot of them are getting paid. So that I think is the kind of grassroots organizing we can do. And, we did that in Syracuse. First time I ran for local office, I got 3%. That was 1993. By 2011, I got 48% in a race where the Working Families Party brought the whole party in to canvass my district. It was a district election for city council. So, it was a 96% vote difference. They probably made the difference. And they did a lot of lying. They didn't, I'd run into the canvassers and they'd ask me for directions because they didn't know, the candidate they were supporting, they didn't know who he was running against. And it was me. And what I'm saying is, we built a base there. And, I still, in that neighborhood, I still live there. People think I'm a counselor, some of them. Or they just come to me, there's a sewer overflowing, or, there's some bad kids, been breaking windows in an abandoned house, or whatever it is. They come to me like, aren't you the counselor? Or, well, we know you can do something about it even if you're not the counselor. So, you know, that's where you want to be, I think. And so that's the kind of organizing we got to do. We got to have that kind of legs on a national campaign or a state campaign to overcome the money. Organized people are going to overcome organized money if we're organized. And, you know, we really got to start from scratch after COVID. You know, everybody's on Zoom, but, you know, not meeting face to face. So we got to get back to that. But I think we can do it.
Currently, the renewable energy sector is growing at approximately 13% annually globally. The United States renewable energy growth stands at 10%, while in China it stands at 33%. If the People's Republic of China is countering climate change far more successfully than the United States today, and if climate change really is the most existential threat facing the human race, what does that say about the future of liberal democracy in the 21st century? Can you repeat the question, please?
He's saying China's renewable sector is growing 33% a year, and U.S. is growing 10%, worldwide is 13%. So since China's doing better, what does that say about liberal democracy?
Yes.
I don't think liberal democracy is the problem. The problem is the ruling class dominating by, you know, dominating the elections with their money. And also, you know, in our case, single-member district winner take all elections, which creates the spoiler problem, and the gerrymandering problem, which creates uncompetitive districts. And the problem with, you know, top-down planning that they have in China is that it's done on, you know, on the tops, over the heads of the working classes. And so their enthusiasm for what they're doing, their ability to disrupt when they, you know, go on strike or protest. There are a lot of environmental problems in China that that's actually the biggest source of unrest in China. And and the problem with authoritarian systems is the more the power is concentrated at the top, the less the information goes, the more the top is interested in its own self, not the whole society. So, and also China's produced that renewable sector, a lot of that's for export. Not so much for China, which, you know, they use a lot of coal, they're still using coal, they're still building coal plants. Although they did cut back because the air got so damn bad in Beijing and some of these other cities, it became really dangerous. So, I guess what I'm saying is, you know, democracy is not the obstacle to decarbonization. In our case, it's the lack of democracy, the domination of our democracy by the fossil fuel industry in particular. Go ahead.
What are your thoughts on the Working Family Party?
Well, on paper, they stand for a lot of good things. In practice, they end up endorsing people that don't support their platform. I mean, I've been through this 3 times with them against Andrew Cuomo. You know, they, let's see, 2010, yeah, they endorsed him straight away. And he was running as a centrist, fiscally conservative, socially liberal, quote unquote, Democrat, although he still had to evolve on marriage equality, which he did in a couple of years. It became very popular. And just as a side note, the contrast to that is the Greens had the mayor and deputy mayor of New Paltz Village, and they started marrying gay couples in 2000, I think it was 2004. Okay, and so Democratic Attorney General Elliot Spitzer got an injunction against them. And the establishment, you know, gay rights group said, oh, you're going to start a backlash. That's when Karl Rove was putting gay issues on referenda in a lot of states to mobilize the Republican vote. But what we did was start a movement. And it wasn't just here, you know, Gavin Newsom then did some marriages in California. And, you know, I've never seen an issue flip so much. I mean, you had Dick Cheney on our side on this one because his daughter was a lesbian. And, you know, from 2004 to 2012, I guess 13 was the decision in the Supreme Court. I mean, attitudes change really fast. And to me, that means, you know, you push forward what's right and, you know, with the confidence that people will see it in the end. So your question was the Working Families Party? Okay, so 2010, they endorsed Cuomo right away. Then, given that he was so conservative on issues like school funding, and fracking became a big issue. It was a big issue for us in 2010. We were at sort of the head of the movement because we were calling for a ban on fracking when, like the Sierra Club was saying, natural gas is the bridge to the renewable future. And then we found out that the gas industry was giving the Sierra Club a lot of money for their Beyond Coal campaign. And then the better parts of the movement were calling for a moratorium, like the Working Families Party. We were saying ban it, not just because of the danger of the water, but because of the climate issue. By 2014, it was a huge issue. Working Families, Green Party, a couple of big nonprofits that got funded. So Zephyr Teachout ran a primary, but the Working Families Party didn't endorse her. They were worried about spoiling the election. And if you talk to some of the people in the Working Families Party, I mean, I know one guy that was told, if you're going to vote for Teachout, don't show up. You're not going to be on the county committee anymore. You know, they showed up at his door. They basically read him the riot act. So there was a lot of arms twisted. But by 2018, they said, yeah, we're going to run this time. So Cynthia Nixon ran. She lost by about the same margin as Teachout. And right away, they endorsed Cuomo. And then this year, they endorsed Jumaane Williams in the primary. But by April, they were saying, well, if he doesn't win, we're going to endorse Hochul. We're not going to be spoilers. Pulling the rug out from Jumaane before he even got started. So the other thing, they get a lot of their money to do the ground game for, you know, big politicians like Schumer or Clinton. And where do they get their money from? Wall Street and so forth. So it's kind of a conduit for that money. So it's kind of a hypocritical thing, in my opinion. I think, you know, if you're independent or if you're progressive, you should be independent of the corporate parties. And the Working Families Party is not. They think they're influencing the Democratic Party. At the margins, they have. You know, we've got some more progressive assembly members and senators. But in the overall picture, they're a margin in the Democratic Party. And I don't think it reflects the strength of, you know, the people that think they want these progressive policies. They're not just scattered in those few districts that are very progressive, like, you know, AOC's district. They're all over the state. An independent party, if we get these electoral changes in particular, you know, that would be much more reflected in the politics. So I think it's inevitable you're going to have a Working Families Party in a state with fusion like New York. So, but I think that's not the answer, you know, politically for the left. Yeah, on the back end, we're going.
So, Howie, I was a Democrat from about 1976 to 2011 when I changed to the Green Party. I kind of got fed up with the Democratic Party being, you know, too beholden to corporate interests, and it really there were problems even at the county and local level. And I like the Green Party platform. It kind of reminded me of McGovern in the 70s. But lately, I've kind of been thinking that we're sort of beating our heads against the wall without getting ranked choice voting in, which I see, you know, even in mainstream journals like Foreign Affairs, people are talking about it like, you know, it's needed. So what would the mechanism be in New York State? Would it be like a permissive referenda? Could we do it at the local issue, local level, starting next year with town races, or what do you recommend in terms of real implementation of it?
Municipalities and counties have home rule on this question in New York, so we can do it there just by legislation. Depends on the city, town, or county. You may have to do a referendum once you pass the legislation or the intent to go that way. Depends on how your charter or your charter for your county or city or town is written, or village. At the state level, we could go just by legislation to rank choice voting for the statewide offices, senator, president, for Proportional ranked choice voting, we could do it by legislation for the Assembly. For the Senate, it would take a constitutional amendment, because there is a clause in the New York State Constitution that says you're going to have single-member districts for senators. So that would have to be changed to go to proportional ranked choice voting in the Senate. And as far as electing our congressional delegation, we could do that by legislation as well, without going to the Constitution.
Yeah, but we're not gonna, I mean, I don't think we're gonna get the Democratic state legislature to do it. And even at the local level, it's primarily Democrats and Republicans. So when I was in town in Jay, like in 2013, the town tried to eliminate one of our town justices, and we were able to get that, at least that issue on the ballot by circulating a petition. So we would be able to do that, you think, for getting ranked choice voting in as a local election system?
There is a mechanism that's challenging to do citizen initiatives at the municipal level in New York State. So you could do that for, ranked choice voting or proportional ranked choice voting. I think in the short term, we can win fair ballot access and ranked choice voting for the statewide offices. I think enough people have seen, like they had the primary in New York, use ranked choice voting for the Democrats. Republicans had it too, but it wasn't much of a contest. But they didn't extend it to the general election. I know the inside story on that. Democrats wrote it. They didn't want the Greens to have a footing in the general election. So they just said, we'll do it for ourselves, and then we'll go to the general election and we'll do winner take all. But that can be changed, because I think most New Yorkers are going to say, yeah, it was good in the primary, why not the general? And I think we can get that passed in the state. And one way to build for that is to get it passed in some of our local communities. Going to proportional representation, ranked choice voting for multi-member districts, I think is the next step. And that'll take some more education and probably some local examples before it becomes an issue statewide. But I think the path is there. And like I said earlier, it's gaining momentum around the country. I mean, I think the time is right now.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Or am I missing anyone over here? Okay, Gabe.
Sure. So I've been concerned for a while now on the state of democracy in our country. So I guess I see you as a credible person to ask, what, in your opinion, is the chances of us losing our democracy if the Republican Party is elected to the presidential office in 2024?
I think they'll diminish the democracy. We won't lose it.
Okay.
We have a democratic culture, values, aspirations. I think most people think that's what, even the Republicans that think the election was stolen, they actually think it was stolen, even though they're dealing with an alternative set of facts that aren't true. A lot of them, are small d Democrats. Unfortunately, some of them are not. I mean, they're right-wing authoritarians. They don't care about elections. They just want the power. But I don't think they're the majority, even of the MAGA crowd. So I think it'll be contested. I mean, we've been here before. Post-Reconstruction, it took 30 years to get Jim Crow fully implemented after the Ku Klux Klan and those other groups violently overthrew some of those Reconstruction governments in the South. And they had to compromise and the federal troops were pulled out. But it still took, from 1877, I think the last state to really finally impose Jim Crow was 1899 in North Carolina. So it was a struggle. And then we had the most racist, segregated, most racist period in the, first, really until World War II, but particularly the 1920s, it seemed to peak. Woodrow Wilson was, unbelievably racist. And then, after World War II and the, blacks and the Japanese in particular, they had the Double V campaign. Victory against Hitler and Tojo and Mussolini, and victory at home against segregation and racism at home. And that really took off after World War II. And we had advancement. And then a backlash started in the late 1960s. And I have to say I was surprised it got worse. I was asked leading up to the presidential race, what about this far right? And I said, they're old and they're dying off. And this is after Trump had been in there. I thought in the polls were showing us Trump was going to get his ass really kicked. And as it turned out, because of the electoral college, we were like 25,000 votes from him winning the electoral college, even though we got 7 million less popular votes. Which is another thing. You would think that the Democratic Party, which has lost the presidency twice in the 21st century, the only time the Republicans got elected, the first time they got in was because they lost the popular vote, but the electoral college put them in. And you would think the Democratic Party would be saying, let's get rid of the electoral college. We almost did in 1969, when Nixon was in there. He supported it. It was something like 370 to 69 for getting rid of the electoral college and instituting a system semi-ranked choice voting. In other words, you have a national popular vote. If nobody got over 40%, you'd have a runoff. And it was the damn Dixiecrats using the filibuster in the Senate that blocked that by just a couple of votes. We almost got rid of it in 1969. And then Democrats haven't brought it up again. Although, after Bush got in, Hillary Clinton, the first thing she did here in New York, down in Binghamton, was say, I'm going to, introduce a law to get rid of the electoral college. There was a bill that Dick Durbin had the previous session. They didn't introduce it that year. And then when, 9/11 happened, they dropped it. There's now a bill just to get rid of the electoral college. Plurality wins, not the 40% runoff thing. It only has 9 co-sponsors in the House. I mean, that's pathetic. It should be an issue. And again, that's why I say we need an independent left that really wants to fight for democracy and bring these issues up. Yeah.
This is a student.
Go ahead.
You talked a lot about the influence of corporate money, and clearly campaign finance reform in the wake of the Citizens United decision is key. But that's there, right? I mean, that's the big one. That's the one that everyone would like to get. Do you have any suggestions or any strategies for curbing, for how one might pursue the curbing of corporate money, short of massive campaign finance reform?
I think, what we got to do is what Bernie Sanders showed us we can do. And that is, millions of people giving small amounts. And a third party would actually have members. Our political parties don't have members in the sense that you agree to a set of principles and you support it with dues. That's an invention of the left, the workers' movement in Europe, and we tried it with the Socialist Party, of Debs. As a way to compete with the top-down elite parties that had been there before the workers got the franchise, the vote. And they were funded by the rich, landlords and big business people. And so, the little people had to pool their money together. In this country, our parties evolved so that by the time we got to the primary system, the state started registering people in the parties. I think it's 27 of the states do that. The other 23, you just show up at the polling place and decide which ballot you want. And then you're in that party for that day. Some states then record that, others don't. But so you don't have a membership that can hold the party accountable in the major parties. Or the Green Party. I mean, we had a big fight over this in the 90s. And the side that wanted to imitate the Democrats and Republicans in terms of structure won. And I think that's a problem because we're underfunded. We have, anybody can join the Green Party. That guy that hit Pelosi's husband on the head with a hammer is registered in the Green Party. The Green Party should, be able to draw some limits. The Lyndon LaRouche fascists, they've won primaries like in Illinois. And Adlai Stevenson III had to run against them. I forget how that worked out. Anyway, the Democrats had to repudiate him, the Republicans had to repudiate David Duke of the Ku Klux Klan, because anybody could get in these parties without having a real membership structure. There's nothing stopping, legally stopping us from having that kind of party. And I think that's where we got to go. And that would give us a foundation of funding. We had a party of 1 million people giving, $10 a month. That's 10 million, that's 120 million a year. And you could do something with that. It's not as much as the labor movement has. They have billions in dues. But that's an example of how, and they pay at a higher rate than we probably can get people to pay party dues. You know, I think, well, as a Teamster, I was paying 2.5% of my wages as dues. And so the Teamsters got a lot of money. That gets into a whole nother discussion about the labor movement. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Howie.
Thank you.